The snow began falling the moment Olivia Everett realized she had lost the trail. And by the time panic truly set in, the world had become nothing but white. She clutched her horse's reins tighter, feeling the mare stumble beneath her on the rocky mountain path that had disappeared somewhere in the last hour. November in Montana territory was unforgiving, and she had been foolish to think she could make the journey from Utica to Helena alone. The mare whinnied, eyes rolling with fear as the wind picked up, and Olivia felt her own heart hammering against her ribs. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher who had come west only 6 months prior, and now she was going to die in these mountains because she had been too proud to wait for the supply wagon that would have left in spring. The horse stumbled again, and this time Olivia felt herself sliding sideways. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs as snow immediately began to soak through her wool traveling dress. The mare bolted, disappearing into the white curtain of the blizzard, and Olivia found herself utterly alone. She struggled to her feet, her carpetbag still somehow clutched in one hand, and looked around desperately for any sign of shelter. The wind howled through the pines, bending them like they were nothing more than grass, and the cold bit through every layer she wore. She stumbled forward, not knowing if she was going uphill or down, only knowing that to stop moving meant to die. Her hands were already numb, her face burning with cold that would soon turn to dangerous numbness. She thought of her sister back in Boston, of the letters she had written about her grand western adventure, about the handsome ranchers and the endless sky. What a fool she had been. What a stupid, romantic fool. Time became meaningless. She fell twice more, each time forcing herself back up through sheer will. Her carpetbag was gone now, lost somewhere behind her. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her face. When she finally found the outcropping of rock that formed a shallow cave, she crawled inside and curled into the smallest ball she could manage, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. She knew this was how it ended. She would fall asleep and never wake up, and no one would find her until spring thaw. She did not know how long she huddled there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The cold had moved past pain into a strange, distant numbness. She thought she heard voices once, but decided it was a dream or a hallucination. Then she slept. Back in Utica, Montana, 3 days earlier, Duncan Pierce had been preparing for a quiet winter at his ranch when Martha Henderson had burst into the general store with news that Olivia Everett, the new schoolteacher, had set out for Helena 2 days prior and had not been seen since. Duncan had been examining a new saddle at the time, running his weathered hands over the leather, but he stopped mid-motion at the news. "Alone?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who already knew the answer would be bad. "Her horse came back this morning," Martha said, wringing her hands. "Without her. The storm hit yesterday afternoon up in the mountains. Sheriff says there is nothing to be done until it clears." Duncan was 26 years old, had been working cattle and horses since he was old enough to sit a saddle, and he knew these mountains better than he knew his own face. He also knew that waiting meant finding a body come spring, not a living woman. He set down the saddle and walked out of the store without another word, heading straight for his ranch to gather supplies. His foreman, an older man named Samuel who had taught Duncan everything he knew about tracking, tried to talk him out of it. "That storm is only getting worse," Samuel said, watching Duncan pack his saddlebags with jerky hardtack, matches wrapped in oilcloth, extra blankets, and rope. "You will die up there looking for a woman who is probably already dead." "Then I will die," Duncan said simply. He saddled his best horse, a big bay gelding named Judge who had never failed him, and led a pack horse behind. He wore his heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low, and he carried his rifle across his saddle. Not because he expected trouble from men, but because wolves and mountain lions grew bold and hungry when snow fell deep. He left before dawn, riding into wind that cut like knives. He had asked around town the night before, piecing together which route Olivia had likely taken. There were two main trails to Helena from Utica, and most people took the lower route that wound through the foothills. But one person had mentioned seeing a woman on a dappled mare heading up toward the higher pass, probably thinking it was more direct. It was more direct. It was also far more dangerous, especially this late in the year. Duncan pushed Judge hard that first day, following the trail as long as there was light. The snow was falling steadily now, covering any tracks that might have remained, but he knew this country. He knew where someone unfamiliar with the territory might go wrong, where the trail forked in ways that were not obvious. When darkness fell, he made a cold camp in the shelter of a rock face, not daring to light a fire that might be blown out by the wind. He chewed jerky and thought about the woman he was tracking. He had seen Olivia Everett around town, of course. Utica was not so large that you could miss anyone, especially not a single woman from back east who dressed in clothes too fine for frontier life, and spoke with an accent that marked her as educated. She had arrived in summer, hired to teach the town's children, and she had thrown herself into the work with an enthusiasm that some found charming and others found naive. Duncan had thought her pretty in a delicate way that seemed ill-suited to Montana, with her dark hair always pinned up neat and her dresses always pressed. He had never spoken to her beyond a tipped hat in passing. Now he was risking his life to find her, and he could not entirely explain why. Partly because it was the right thing to do, partly because he knew he had the skills to do it, and partly, if he was honest with himself, because the thought of her dying alone in the cold made something in his chest twist in a way he did not want to examine too closely. The second day was worse. The storm had intensified overnight, and by mid-morning Duncan could barely see Judge's ears in front of him. He dismounted and led the horse, checking the ground constantly for any sign that someone had passed this way. He found it around noon, a piece of dark blue fabric caught on a branch, half buried in snow. He recognized it as matching the color of the dress he had seen Olivia wearing the last time he saw her in town. His heart began to beat faster. She had come this way, and not long ago. A day, maybe two at most. He pressed on, moving more carefully now, looking for any other signs. He found hoofprints that had been partially filled with snow, leading off the main trail toward a more difficult path. He cursed under his breath. She had gotten lost, probably in the early part of the storm, and had wandered away from the safer route. He followed the tracks until they disappeared entirely, then kept going based on instinct and experience, trying to think like someone who was lost and frightened. That night, he did risk a small fire, building it in a sheltered spot and feeding it carefully. He needed to warm himself enough to keep going, and he needed to cook some of the coffee he had brought. As he sat by the flames, he thought about what he would find when he caught up to her. Best case, she had found shelter and was cold but alive. Worst case, she was already gone. He tried not to think about the worst case. The third day dawned clearer, the storm finally beginning to blow itself out. Duncan was in the saddle before first light, driving Judge and the pack horse harder now that visibility was better. He was high in the mountains now, in country so rough that even experienced travelers avoided it. The fact that Olivia had made it this far was either a miracle or a testament to blind luck. He almost missed the cave. It was set back from the trail, just an overhang of rock that would have been easy to overlook. But something made him stop, some instinct he could not name. He dismounted and walked over, his boots crunching in the snow that was now knee-deep in places. That was when he saw the dark shape huddled at the back of the shallow cave, and his heart stopped. She was curled in a tight ball, her dark dress crusted with ice and snow, her face so pale it was almost blue. For a terrible moment, Duncan thought he was too late, that he had tracked her for 3 days only to find a frozen corpse. Then he saw her chest move with a shallow breath, and he was inside the cave and pulling off his coat in one motion. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from days of not speaking. "Hey, can you hear me?" Olivia did not respond. Her eyes were closed, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. Duncan wrapped his heavy sheepskin coat around her and began rubbing her hands and arms vigorously, trying to get blood flowing. He had seen frostbite before, had seen men lose fingers and toes and worse to the cold. Her hands were like ice, her fingers stiff, but when he checked them carefully in the thin morning light, he did not see the telltale blackness that meant the tissue was dead. "Come on," he said, still rubbing her arms. "Come on, stay with me. You are safe now, I have got you." He did not know if she could hear him, but he kept talking anyway, his voice low and steady. He pulled her closer, sharing his body heat, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, her eyelids fluttered. "That is it," Duncan said. "Open your eyes, come on." Olivia's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. They were blue, he noticed, the color of deep water. She looked at him without recognition, without any apparent understanding of where she was or what was happening. "You are safe," Duncan said again. "My name is Duncan. I am from Utica. I have been tracking you for 3 days. You are safe now." She blinked at him, and he saw her trying to process his words. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap with numb fingers, and held it to her lips. "Small sips," he said. "Not too fast." She drank, and some of the water spilled down her chin, but she managed to swallow. After a few sips, she pushed the canteen away weakly, and he saw awareness starting to return to her eyes. "Cold," she whispered, her voice so hoarse he barely heard it. "I know," he said. "We need to get you warmed up. Can you move? Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs would not hold her. Duncan made a decision. He gathered her up in his arms, careful of her cold, stiffened limbs, and carried her out to where Judge waited patiently. The horse snorted at the sight of them, but stood steady as Duncan managed to get Olivia into the saddle. He swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her to hold her in place, and turned Judge back down the trail. He could not make it all the way back to Utica today, not with a woman in Olivia's condition. But he knew there was an old trapper's cabin about 2 hours' ride from here, and if it was still standing, it would have a fireplace and 4 walls and a roof. That would have to be enough. Olivia drifted in and out of consciousness as they rode. Duncan kept talking to her, telling her about the country they were passing through, about his ranch, about anything he could think of to keep her aware and fighting. When she sagged against him, her head lolling back against his shoulder, he found himself holding her tighter, willing his warmth into her body. The cabin was still there, thank God, and mostly intact. Duncan dismounted and lifted Olivia down, carrying her inside and laying her on the rough wooden bunk that stood against one wall. Then he went back out to tend to the horses, unsaddling them quickly and rubbing them down, making sure they had shelter in the lean-to attached to the cabin. Every minute he was outside felt like an hour, his worry for Olivia gnawing at him. When he came back inside, she was shivering violently, which he knew was actually a good sign. It meant her body was trying to warm itself. He got a fire going in the fireplace, using wood from the supply the last occupant had left stacked by the hearth, and soon had flames crackling and heat beginning to spread through the small space. Then came the hard part. Olivia's dress was soaked through, half frozen, and it had to come off. Duncan hesitated, aware of propriety, aware that she was unconscious and vulnerable. But he was also aware that if he left her in wet clothes, she could still die of exposure. "I am sorry," he said to her, even though she could not hear him. "But this is necessary." He worked quickly and efficiently, removing her wet dress and petticoats, wrapping her in dry blankets from his pack. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible, treating her with the same impersonal care he would give an injured animal. Her modesty mattered less than her life, but he still tried to preserve what he could of it. Once she was wrapped in blankets, he positioned her near the fire and began warming water in his tin cup. When it was hot, he added some of the coffee grounds he had been using for the past 3 days and held it to her lips again. "Drink this," he said. "It will help." This time Olivia was more aware, and she drank the bitter coffee without protest. Color was starting to return to her face, and the violent shivering was subsiding into occasional tremors. Her eyes focused on him properly for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but stronger. "Duncan Pierce," he said. "I have a ranch outside Utica. I have been looking for you since the storm hit." 3 days, she whispered, remembering. "You said 3 days." "Yes, madam." "Why would you do that? You could have died." Duncan shrugged, feeling uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "Could not just leave you out here." "Most people would have." "I am not most people." They looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was going to die," she said. "I was so scared." "I know," Duncan said gently. "But you are safe now. I promise you are safe." The tears spilled over, running down her cheeks, and she began to sob, all the fear and terror of the past 3 days pouring out of her. Duncan did something he had not planned to do, something that went against every rule of propriety he knew. He gathered her into his arms, blankets and all, and held her while she cried. "You are safe," he repeated over and over. "I have got you. You are safe." Olivia cried herself out against his chest, her fingers clutching at his shirt, and Duncan found himself stroking her hair, making soothing sounds like he would to a frightened horse. Except she was not a horse. She was a woman, and she was warm in his arms, and something was shifting inside him that he had not expected. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to fall apart like that." "You have nothing to apologize for," Duncan said. "You have been through hell." "My own fault," she said bitterly. "Everyone told me not to go alone. Everyone said to wait, but I thought I knew better. I thought I could handle it." "You survived," Duncan pointed out. "That is more than most people would have done. You found shelter. You stayed alive until I found you. That took strength." Olivia looked at him with something like wonder. "You really did track me for 3 days, in a blizzard, for someone you do not even know." "I know you," Duncan said. "You are the schoolteacher. You came from Boston. You live in the room above the general store. You walk to school every morning at 7:30. You wave at kids on the street. You noticed all that." Duncan felt heat rise in his face. "Utica is not that big." Something shifted in Olivia's expression, a softness that had not been there before. "What is your name again?" "Duncan Pierce." "Duncan," she repeated, like she was testing how it felt on her tongue. "Thank you, Duncan. You saved my life." "You are welcome, Olivia." The use of her first name seemed to surprise her, but she smiled slightly. It was the first smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made his heart skip. They stayed in the cabin that night, there being no choice. Duncan kept the fire going and made them a simple meal from his supplies, heating beans and hardtack until they were at least warm if not exactly appetizing. Olivia ate hungrily, her appetite returning with her warmth, and Duncan found himself watching her, noticing small things. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her nose wrinkled slightly when she took a bite of the bland food, the way her eyes kept darting to him and then away, like she was trying to figure him out. "Tell me about your ranch," she said after they had eaten, so Duncan told her. He told her about the 160 acres he had homesteaded 5 years ago, building the cabin and barn with his own hands. He told her about the cattle he ran, modest numbers but good stock. He told her about his plans to expand, to build a proper house, to maybe start breeding horses as well as cattle. He talked more than he usually did, drawn out by her questions and her genuine interest. "It sounds wonderful," Olivia said wistfully. "I have only ever lived in cities. Boston and then Utica, which is not much of a city but it is still a town. I have never seen what it would be like to live on a ranch." "It is hard work," Duncan said honestly. "Up before dawn, work all day, fall into bed exhausted at night. Winter is isolating. Summer is hot and dusty. But it is mine, you know. I built it, I own it. No landlord, no boss, just me and the land." "That must be an incredible feeling," Olivia said. She was sitting up now, wrapped in blankets, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the firelight she looked different from the prim schoolteacher he had seen in town, softer, more real. "Why did you come west?" Duncan asked. "Most women from Boston stay in Boston." Olivia was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I wanted something different," she said finally. "My life there was so prescribed, you know. I would have married some boring merchant's son, had boring children, lived in a boring house, and died having never done anything interesting. When I saw the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Montana Territory, it felt like a door opening. A chance to have an adventure, to matter, to do something that mattered." "You matter," Duncan said. "Those kids you teach, they need you. Most of them would not get any education otherwise." "I know," Olivia said, "and I love teaching. I really do. But today, freezing to death on a mountain, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if I had been foolish to come here." "Today was bad luck and bad weather," Duncan said. "Not bad choices. Well, maybe one bad choice going alone, but that does not mean you should not be here. You think so?" "I know so." They talked long into the night, sharing stories, learning about each other. Duncan told her about growing up in Wyoming, about learning to ride before he could walk, about his parents dying of fever when he was 19, and how he had struck out on his own after that. Olivia told him about her family in Boston, her 3 older brothers who had all become lawyers like their father, her sister who had married well and lived in a mansion on Beacon Hill. She told him about feeling like she never quite fit, like there was something wrong with her for wanting more than what she was supposed to want. "There is nothing wrong with you," Duncan said quietly. "You are brave, braver than most men I know." "I did not feel brave on that mountain," Olivia said. "I felt terrified." "Being brave does not mean not being scared," Duncan said. "It means doing things even when you are scared." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. A rough cowboy, I suppose, someone who did not think much or feel much, but you are thoughtful, you listen, you notice things." Duncan felt that warmth in his face again. "I am still a cowboy." "A thoughtful cowboy," Olivia said and smiled. That night, Duncan gave Olivia the bunk and made himself a bed on the floor near the fire. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing even out as she fell asleep, thinking about everything that had happened. 3 days ago she had been just the schoolteacher, someone he saw around town but never really knew. Now he felt like he was beginning to understand her, to see past the exterior to the person beneath. And what he saw made his chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. They left the next morning, riding double on Judge with the pack horse trailing behind. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the world transformed into a pristine white landscape that sparkled in the sun. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. As it was, Duncan was focused entirely on getting Olivia back to town safely. She sat in front of him, wrapped in his coat and several blankets, and he kept his arms around her, ostensibly to keep her steady but really because he liked having her close. She leaned back against him trustingly, and he found himself acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies. "Duncan," she said at one point, her voice hesitant. "Yes, when we get back to town, what happens?" He knew what she was really asking. What happens to this thing between us, this connection that formed over 3 days in desperate circumstances? Would it survive the return to normal life, or would it fade like a dream? "I suppose that depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether you want to see me again." "After this, I mean, not just passing on the street." Olivia turned her head to look at him, and her face was very close to his. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." Something tight in Duncan's chest loosened. "Then I will call on you properly, if that is all right." "That is more than all right." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when Utica finally came into view in the valley below them, Duncan felt an unexpected pang of regret. The journey was ending. The extraordinary circumstances that had thrown them together were coming to a close. Now they would have to see if what they had found could survive in the ordinary world. The town erupted when they rode in. People came running from all directions, shouting and exclaiming. The doctor was fetched, and Martha Henderson and several other women swept Olivia away to be examined and fussed over. Duncan was surrounded by men wanting to know what had happened, slapping him on the back and calling him a hero. He deflected their praise, just saying he had done what anyone would have done. Knowing that was not quite true through the crowd, his eyes met Olivia's as she was being led away, and she mouthed 2 words at him. "Thank you." He nodded, and then she was gone, and he was left with his tired horse and the weight of his own feelings. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Duncan went back to his ranch, to the familiar routine of chores and work, but found his mind wandering constantly to Olivia. Was she all right? Had she recovered? Was she thinking about him the way he was thinking about her? He waited a week, wanting to give her time to recover, wanting to be proper about things. Then he rode into town on a Saturday afternoon, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt, and knocked on the door of the room above the general store where Olivia lived. She opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her hair pinned up neatly, and she looked healthy and whole and beautiful. "Duncan," she said, and her smile was everything he had been hoping for. "I came to call," he said, feeling awkward and formal, "if that is still all right." "Come in," she said, stepping back. Her room was small but neat, with a bed in one corner and a small table with 2 chairs. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves and piled on the windowsill. Duncan took off his hat and sat when she gestured to a chair. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Much better," Olivia said. "The doctor said I was lucky. No lasting damage from the cold. I lost a toenail, but that is the extent of it. I am glad." "Duncan, I have been wanting to see you," Olivia said, leaning forward, "to thank you properly. What you did, tracking me for 3 days, risking your life, I cannot ever repay that." "I do not want repayment," Duncan said. I was hoping I would like to court you, if you are willing." The words came out in a rush, not at all smooth like he had planned. But Olivia's face lit up with a joy that made his heart soar. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I am willing. I am more than willing." So began the courtship of Duncan Pierce and Olivia Everett, and it became the talk of Utica. He called on her every Saturday afternoon, sitting in her small room drinking tea and talking for hours. He took her on rides through the countryside, showing her the land he loved, teaching her about the rhythms of ranch life. She read him poetry and told him stories about her students, about the funny things children said and did. They went to church together on Sundays, sitting side by side in the pews while the town watched with approval and curiosity. They attended the Christmas social together, and Duncan discovered that Olivia loved to dance, her eyes sparkling as he spun her around the floor. With every day that passed, Duncan fell deeper in love. He loved her intelligence, the way she could debate any topic and hold her own. He loved her passion for teaching, the way she talked about her students with such genuine care. He loved her bravery, the core of steel beneath her delicate exterior. He loved the way she laughed, throwing her head back unselfconsciously. He loved how she looked at him like he was someone special, someone worth knowing. Olivia, for her part, found herself falling just as hard. She loved Duncan's quiet strength, the way he was always steady and reliable. She loved how he listened when she talked, really listened, asking thoughtful questions and remembering details. She loved his gentleness with animals, the way his horses and cattle trusted him completely. She loved his dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. She loved the way he made her feel safe, not just physically but emotionally, like she could be entirely herself around him. Winter deepened, and Duncan taught Olivia to ride better, giving her a gentle mare from his own stock. They took long rides together, and she fell in love not just with him but with the land itself, with the vast Montana sky and the mountains in the distance, and the way the snow sparkled under endless blue. It was on one of these rides in late January that Duncan stopped his horse on a ridge overlooking his ranch. Olivia pulled up beside him, her cheeks pink from the cold and the exercise, her eyes bright. "Olivia," Duncan said, his voice suddenly serious, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, concern crossing her face. "I love you," he said, the words simple and true. "I have loved you since I found you in that cave, maybe even before that. I know it has only been a few months and maybe it is too soon, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. I love you." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "It is not too soon," she said. "And I love you too. I have been wanting to say it for weeks." Duncan dismounted and helped her down from her horse, and then he was kissing her, his cold lips on her cold lips, and the world fell away. There was nothing but the two of them, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had been given a second chance at life and were choosing to spend it together. When they finally broke apart, Duncan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I have been carrying this around for 2 weeks," he admitted, "waiting for the right moment. Olivia Everett, will you marry me?" The ring inside the box was simple, a thin gold band with a small sapphire, and Olivia thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in March, when the first signs of spring were beginning to show through the snow. The ceremony was held in Utica's small church, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to witness it. Olivia wore a white dress that Martha Henderson and the other women had helped her sew, and Duncan wore a new suit that made him uncomfortable, but that Olivia said made him look handsome. When the preacher asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Duncan said, "I do," in a voice that rang through the church, clear and certain. And when Olivia said the same, her voice was just as strong, just as sure. They held the reception in the town hall, with music and dancing and food that everyone had contributed to. As Duncan danced with his new wife, Holding her close and spinning her around the floor, he caught her eye and saw his own joy reflected back at him. "No regrets?" he asked, smiling. "Not a single one," Olivia said. "Getting lost in those mountains was the best thing that ever happened to me." "That is a strange way to look at it. It brought you to me," she said simply. "How could I regret that?" They moved to Duncan's ranch after the wedding, and Olivia threw herself into ranch life with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to tend a vegetable garden, to help with the horses. She continued teaching, riding into town 3 days a week to hold classes, and the rest of the time she was at Duncan's side, learning this new life. It was not always easy. The isolation got to her sometimes, used as she was to city life. The work was hard and endless. There were times when they disagreed, when her Eastern sensibilities clashed with his Western practicality. But they learned to compromise, to communicate, to give each other space when needed and support when required. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and growth, of learning each other's rhythms and patterns. The second year was easier, smoother, as they settled into partnership that was more than just romance. They worked side by side, building their life together, making plans for the future. In the third year, Olivia discovered she was expecting a baby. She told Duncan over dinner one night in early spring, and she watched his face transform from confusion to understanding to pure joy. "A baby," he said, his voice wondering. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Olivia said, laughing at his expression. "In October, the doctor thinks." Duncan came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully like she might break. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you so much." Their son was born on a cold October morning, with Martha Henderson serving as midwife and Duncan pacing frantically in the other room. When Martha finally emerged and told him he had a healthy baby boy, Duncan thought his heart might burst. He went in to find Olivia exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Meet your son," she said. Duncan took the baby carefully, cradling him against his chest, and looked down at the small red face. His son. His and Olivia's. "What should we name him?" Olivia asked. They had discussed names before, but now, looking at the actual baby, nothing they had considered seemed quite right. Duncan thought about it, thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Samuel," he said finally. "After my foreman who tried to talk me out of going after you. If he had succeeded, none of this would have happened." Olivia smiled. "Samuel Pierce, I like that." Little Samuel grew into a robust, curious child who toddled around the ranch getting into everything. 2 years after his birth, Olivia gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, and 3 years after that, another son they called James. The ranch house that Duncan had built with his own hands grew too small, so they added on, room by room, until it was a proper family home. The years passed in the way years do when you are happy, speeding by almost too fast to catch. Duncan's ranch prospered, growing into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Olivia continued teaching until Catherine was born, then focused on raising their children and managing the household. But she never lost her love of learning, and she made sure all 3 of their children could read and write and think for themselves. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Duncan took Olivia back up into the mountains, to the place where he had found her. They rode together on the same trail, though this time in summer when the wildflowers bloomed and the sun was warm on their faces. When they reached the cave where she had huddled 10 years before, they dismounted and went inside. It was just as Duncan remembered it, a shallow overhang of rock that had seemed like such a miracle when he had found her. "I still have nightmares sometimes," Olivia admitted, standing in the cave. about being cold, about thinking I was going to die. I am sorry, Duncan said, taking her hand. Do not be, she said, squeezing his fingers. Because I also dream about you finding me, about opening my eyes and seeing you there, about realizing I was saved. And when I wake up from those dreams, you are always still there beside me, and I know it was not a dream. It was real. You are real. This life we have built is real. Duncan pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. I would track you through 1,000 blizzards, he said. I would search for 3,000 days. You are worth it. You have always been worth it. I love you, Olivia said, her voice muffled against his chest. I love you too, Duncan said. They stood there for a long moment, in that cave in the mountains, holding each other and thinking about the incredible journey that had brought them together. A journey that had started with disaster and ended with everything either of them had ever wanted. The children grew. Samuel became a serious boy who loved working with the cattle, who had his father's patience and quiet strength. Catherine was wild and free, always climbing trees and racing her horse across the open range, with her mother's bravery and her father's love of the land. James was the dreamer, always reading books and asking questions, inheriting his mother's intellectual curiosity. Duncan and Olivia grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced hardships, droughts and harsh winters, the death of friends, the challenges that came with raising children in a hard country. But they faced them together, side by side, partners in every sense of the word. When Montana became a state in 1889, they celebrated with the rest of Utica, though Duncan joked that it did not make much difference to them. They were still ranchers, still working the same land, still living the life they had chosen. Samuel grew up and married a girl from Helena, bringing her back to the ranch to help run the growing operation. Catherine shocked everyone by becoming a deputy sheriff, the first woman to hold such a position in their county, and she was fierce and fearless in the role. James went east to college, but he came back, unable to stay away from Montana for long, and became a teacher like his mother. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Duncan and Olivia hosted a party for what seemed like half the state. Their children and grandchildren were there, friends from all over Montana, people whose lives they had touched in ways large and small. As Duncan stood on the porch of their house, watching the celebration, Olivia came and slipped her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About that day I rode out to find you," Duncan said. "About how I had no idea that I was not just saving your life. You saved mine too, in a way. Before you, I was just existing. Working, surviving, but not really living. You taught me how to live." Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder. "We taught each other," she said. "I was so lost, Duncan, not just on that mountain, but in life. I did not know who I was or what I wanted. You helped me figure it out." "And what did you figure out?" Duncan asked, smiling. "That I wanted this," Olivia said, gesturing to the scene before them. The land stretching out under the big Montana sky, the house full of family and laughter, the life they had built together from nothing. "That I wanted you. Every day for the rest of my life I want you." "You have me," Duncan said, pulling her close. "You always have. From the moment I found you in that cave, you have had all of me." They stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Duncan thought about all the years behind them and all the years still ahead. He thought about how one choice, one decision to ride out into a blizzard looking for a woman he barely knew, had changed everything, had given him a life beyond anything he could have imagined. He thought about the 3 days he had tracked her through the mountains, never giving up, never stopping, driven by something he had not fully understood at the time. Now he understood. It had been love, even then. Love at first sight, maybe, or love at first thought, or just the universe pushing two souls together because they were meant to find each other. However it had happened, he was grateful. Grateful for the snow that had trapped Olivia in those mountains. Grateful for his skill as a tracker. Grateful for his own stubborn refusal to give up. Grateful for every single thing that had led to this moment, standing on his porch with the woman he loved more than life itself. "Duncan," Olivia said, looking up at him. "Yes, thank you for finding me." "Thank you for being worth finding," he said, and kissed her as the sun set over Montana and their family celebrated around them. Years continued to pass. Duncan's hair turned silver and Olivia's dark hair streaked with white, but their love never aged. They still took rides together through the mountains, though at a slower pace now. They still sat up late talking, sharing their thoughts and dreams. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort in familiar touch. When Duncan was 63, he fell sick with pneumonia one harsh winter. For a week, Olivia sat by his bedside, refusing to leave, holding his hand and telling him he was not allowed to leave her. The doctor was doubtful, but Olivia was determined, and Duncan, hearing her voice through his fever, fought his way back to health. "You tracked me through a blizzard once," Olivia said when he was finally well enough to sit up and take notice. "Did you really think I was going to let you slip away from me now?" Duncan laughed weakly. "I should have known better." They had 11 more years together after that, years they treated as the gift they were. They watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party even bigger than the 25th had been, with people coming from all over to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in Montana. The schoolteacher who had gotten lost in the mountains, and the cowboy who had tracked her for 3 days straight. The love story that had started with disaster and become something beautiful and lasting. When Duncan finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74 with Olivia holding his hand, the funeral was attended by hundreds. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren spoke about his kindness, his strength, his love for the land and for his family. But it was Olivia who had the last word. She stood at his grave, her back straight despite her years, her blue eyes still sharp, and she told the story one more time. The story of how he had ridden into a blizzard to find her, how he had tracked her for 3 days, never giving up. How he had saved her life and, in doing so, had given her everything she had ever wanted. "He was the best man I ever knew," Olivia said, her voice clear and strong. "And I was blessed beyond measure to be his wife. He told me once that he would track me through 1,000 blizzards, and I believed him. He was that kind of man, steadfast, true, loyal to his very core. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will also be grateful. Grateful that I got lost in those mountains. Grateful that the snow hit when it did. Grateful that Duncan Pierce was the kind of man who would ride out into a storm to save someone he barely knew. That was who he was. That is how I want him remembered." Olivia lived another 7 years after Duncan's death. Years she spent with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, making sure they knew the kind of man he had been. She returned often to the ranch that they had built together, walking the land and remembering. And sometimes, when the snow fell in winter, she would stand at the window and think about those 3 days in the mountains, about being lost and scared and certain she would die, about opening her eyes to find a stranger who would become her everything, about a love that had lasted 57 years and would last beyond death itself. When Olivia finally joined Duncan, passing quietly in her sleep at the age of 81, her family buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch. Her gravestone bore her name and dates, and below that, a single line that her children had chosen. She was worth finding. The ranch continued through the generations, the Pierce name becoming synonymous with good cattle and honest dealing. The story was passed down, parent to child to grandchild, the tale of how the family began. How Olivia Everett got lost in the mountains when the snow hit. How Duncan Pierce tracked her for 3 days straight. How they fell in love and built a life that became a legacy. And every time it snowed in Montana, there was someone in the Pierce family who would look out at the white world and think about that long-ago blizzard. About a woman who was lost and a man who refused to give up. About 3 days that changed everything. About a love story that started in desperate circumstances and became something that lasted for generations. The cave in the mountains where Duncan found Olivia became something of a family landmark. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would ride up to see it, standing in the shallow space and trying to imagine what it must have been like. To be that cold, that scared, that close to death. And then to be saved. Some said the cave was blessed, that love born in such circumstances had a special kind of magic to it. Others said it was just a good story, the kind families like to tell about themselves. But everyone agreed on one thing. Duncan and Olivia Pierce had loved each other with a depth and devotion that was rare and special. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the land they had claimed and built upon. The ranch had grown and changed over the years, modernizing with the times, but the heart of it remained the same. Good land, good stock, and the understanding that family mattered most. On the 150th anniversary of Duncan and Olivia's meeting, the family gathered at the ranch for a reunion. There were Pierces from all over Montana and beyond, descendants of Samuel and Catherine and James, all of them carrying some piece of Duncan and Olivia in their blood and bones. They rode up to the cave in the mountains, a long procession of riders on horseback, and they stood together in that place where their family had truly begun. Someone read the story aloud, the details preserved in journals and letters that had been carefully kept through the generations. When the reading was finished, they were all quiet, thinking about those two people who had started it all. Olivia, brave and lost and determined to survive. Duncan, steady and skilled and unwilling to give up. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and had chosen to build something lasting. As they rode back down the mountain, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. And if you looked closely, if you really paid attention, you might have imagined you could see two figures riding ahead of the group. A man in a sheepskin coat on a big bay horse. A woman beside him, her dark hair loose in the wind. But that was just imagination, just the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love and the history that shapes us. The truth was simpler and more profound. Duncan Pierce had tracked Olivia Everett for 3 days through a blizzard, and in finding her, he had found his future. She had been lost in the mountains when the snow hit, and he had saved her. And together they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a love story. A family, a legacy, that was what mattered, that was what endured. And every winter, when the snow fell on Montana, someone would remember.